We're dealing with idiots in power, and they speak occasionally and we all just go, oh God, idiots. And, we're just waiting for the election. Genuinely, I'm speaking to you very, very frankly at this point. No one cares what Rishi Sunak has to say apart from his little buddies that he's trying to play to.
Today, we're speaking to Dr. Myriam Francois, a Franco-Irish journalist and filmmaker who's been outspoken on Israel's war in Gaza. We're going to talk to her about Rishi Sunak's latest speech, as well as how Western leaders and Western media have been responding to this ongoing war. Dr. Myriam Francois, thank you so much for speaking to us on Real Talk Online.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start off by Rishi Sunak's recent speech. I mean, he gave a speech claiming that the Gaza demonstrations were indicative of extremists undermining British democracy. Now, it's been called an impromptu speech, but why do you think he gave it?
Well, can I just first start by pointing out that I don't know whose Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is, but he's definitely not mine. We haven't really had an elected government in, oh God, a long time here in the UK. So whatever these chumps are posing as, it certainly isn't as an elected official, albeit that they have the title. Why did Rishi Sunak do what he, do this sort of very performative speech, outside 10 Downing Street, given the urgency of the situation? It's just distraction techniques. I mean, we are dealing with a government which, for all intents and purposes, is the most corrupt government that we have had in my lifetime, certainly. It's a kleptocracy. We're currently living in a kleptocracy in the UK. We've never had such a huge gap between wealth, the wealthy and the poor. We have seen the decimation of every public service, from healthcare to education. Basic things like water and gas and electric have gone through the roof. Households across the country are suffering. People are increasingly reliant on food banks. So look, we know what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a corrupt corrupt mafia in power, as far as I'm concerned. And in order to distract the British public from the very, very righteous anger that they feel at the state of the country, they're using the classic divide and conquer strategy. Look over there, look at the brown people over there doing terrible things. I genuinely don't know how many people are buying into this BS. I don't think it's as many as he might hope. I think it's really clear to everyone right now that this sort of dog whistling, this racial dog whistling, this attempt to sort of deflect responsibility from the abysmal, and I mean abysmal, performance that this government has given to Britain, is by stirring up racial hatred. So congratulations to Rishi, really a star on the stirring up racial hatred card. The reality is that actually the Palestine marches are a march for a ceasefire. They're march for humanity. They are predominantly, I've been to many of them, attended by families and people who just really want an end to the bloodshed. So let's put it this way. If Rishi's listening, and I really hope you are, if it's extremist to want all lives to be equally important and to want a ceasefire, then cool. We're all extremists. We'll take it. But, I just don't think anyone cares what Rishi has to say anymore. He's a waste man. Like literally, that's one of the chants, right, on the marches is Rishi is a waste man, and it's never, ever been truer.
Even if we look at the optics of it, what is the point of this speech in general? Because it's been slammed by Sunak's critics as sounding authoritarian. I mean, even the London mayor came out and said, we live in the UK, not Russia, not North Korea. So what's the point of sounding authoritarian, as his critics have said?
Like I said, he's trying to fight off a threat to the Tories. Well, not a threat that they might win the election, but certainly that they will divide the Tory vote from a competing party, which is now another kind of competing fringe, ugly little, fascist party.
So there's an easy scapegoat, is what you're saying.
Well, like I said, it's a distraction technique. So it's a way of saying, actually the real problem that we're facing in this country, which are multiple and structural and ultimately due to political neglect of the majority of the population in favor of accruing wealth and private interests to cronyisms, cronies, the sort of government buddies. In lieu of any accountability over that, we now have this sort of dog whistling that, the problem is with the Muslims and with the extremists. And we're all just a bit tired of it because, it's not like we haven't heard it all before under Cameron.
And what do you think it will lead to? Like, do you think it will have any ramifications?
Genuinely, no. I just think, we're dealing with idiots in power and they speak occasionally and we all just go, oh God, idiots. And, we're just waiting for the election. Genuinely, I'm speaking to you very, very frankly at this point. No one cares what Rishi Sunak has to say apart from his little buddies that he's trying to play to, who already know that this is all about just trying to sort of pander to the more extreme parts of the Conservative Party who might be lured by these new fascistic parties, even more to the far right than they've taken the party already. And, the truth is, if that's the direction that they want to go in, then at this point, it's civil war that they're going for. You cannot sort of drag a country into the depths of economic despair, which is what they have done, right? Created huge amounts of poverty, people living in destitution. The homeless crisis is off the charts. And at the same time, think that the British public is so dumb that they don't recognize that the real problem is with those in power. So I get it. There'll be a few people who sort of buy into this idea that the extremists are taking over. But I really just think that the majority of people are very clear on what the problem is. And that's the people in government.
If we move on to another event from recent days, what's been called the Flower Massacre in Gaza City. I mean, at least 112 Palestinians were killed when Israeli forces opened fire near an aid convoy. Now, the Israeli version of the events shifted throughout the day. I mean, first it was, the people died because of a stampede, they got stampeded, but then it became, the Israeli forces fired because they felt threatened when they were approached by what they called the mob. And then they released that footage, that drone footage, which, the BBC has verified was edited into 4 different sections. How did you see all of this playing out?
I mean, look, we've seen the Hasbara, the Israeli propaganda machine, in full flow since the beginning of this conflict. I think the only people who are surprised are those who haven't been paying attention for the last 76 years. So, look, the Flower Massacre is exactly what we knew it would be, which is throughout the most recent assault on Gaza, we have seen every and any justification given for the murder of Palestinians. And so, of course, initially we had the sort of, oh, it's just, it's all terrorists we're going for. Then it was, well, we're aiming for the terrorists, but there's a lot of collateral. Turns out the collateral is like 25,000 women and children. And ultimately, I think that we have then, over the course of the last few months, seen footage come out. We've had testimonies from doctors saying, on one shift that they were in a hospital in Gaza, they had a handful of children between the ages of 5 and 8 come in, all who had sniper shots to the head. We have seen evidence of massacres happen in school and UN buildings, UNRWA buildings, where people were clearly shot, executed. So look, the Flower Massacre is in line with what we have seen so far, which is that unfortunately, the Israeli occupying forces, the IOF, are not being constrained by any of the codes that they claim to be governed by. And the real issue, I think, is that this very clear and unequivocal flouting of international law, with the eyes of the world on them, not only has very serious long-term consequences for, I think, Israel's legitimacy in the public arena going forward, but also now we're very clear on the fact that the only country that's in a position to put a leash on Israel at this point is America. And it's looking more and more like a US proxy war in the Middle East again, which is, the reason I say that is, of course, that America is simultaneously giving sort of lip service to this, with the sort of Kamala Harris coming out, oh, the humanitarian situation, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, yeah.
Simultaneously, of course, continuing to drop bombs and arm Israel and effectively not use any of the levers that they could use to try and stop Israel. Now, to me, that just looks like a proxy war. You know, if it smells like a proxy war, it looks like a proxy war, maybe it just is a proxy war. So increasingly, my analysis of the situation is that this is an American war on Gaza. Israel is just the intermediary, because the truth is that if America wanted this to stop, they could.
But what about your analysis of the mainstream media coverage of it, for example? I mean, just to cite one example, CNN called it a chaotic incident. So how did you see it unfold in the media?
The unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in with regards to the coverage of this conflict is that there is a high degree of geographical, cultural illiteracy in the media. I observe this in particular by virtue of the fact that we very, very rarely hear Arab voices in Arabic speaking at all on this conflict, right? We hear Israeli officials, we occasionally hear the Palestinian ambassador. We never actually hear from Palestinians in Arabic talking about their own struggle for national liberation, which is what we're talking about. It's a national liberation movement. These are unoccupied people under international law who have a right to liberate themselves from the occupation. And of course, conversely, Israel, as an occupying power, does not have the right to self-defense in the way that it's being portrayed in the media, but has a right to provide for and protect the population that it is occupying. And so if some of these basic frameworks were intelligible to our fellow reporters and newsrooms, as they should be, because these are sort of 101 of the conflict, that this is a conflict that is governed by international law, that there is such a notion as an occupying power and an occupied people, then I think that coverage might be a little bit different. But of course, the media is a reflection of wider power relations in which there is ongoing perceptions that, the sort of white Christendom continues to be under the assault, and if it's not Christendom, it's Judeo-Christendom is somehow under assault from these savage Muslims. And of course, we know this is nothing to do with religion. This is a territorial struggle. It always has been. And I think it suits certain parties to continue to represent it as somehow being a religious struggle. It is very clearly and unequivocally not a religious struggle. As we know, Palestinians can be both Christian, Muslim, and of course, there were historically many Jewish Palestinians too. So this is all about territory. And I think if our newsrooms were a little bit better educated, perhaps a little bit more diverse when it comes to having more Arab voices in the room who actually can help influence the way the editorial understands events in the region, rather than sort of just using them for face value, then we might have slightly different coverage. But at the moment, my experience and what I'm seeing on the ground in our profession, which by the way has a really, really poor track record on diversity anyway, is that the very few Arab voices I'm seeing in the newsroom are sort of relegated to jobs that don't allow them to have any say on editorial, in particular when it comes to maybe just helping people recognize context and wider cultural paradigms.
And how do you think this gap, let's say, is contributing to the portrayal of Palestinians in the media?
Well, I think the main issue that the mainstream media has is that increasingly, particularly younger people, are looking to social media for their news. And on social media, as much as there is disinformation, undoubtedly, on both sides, there is also the circulation of raw footage. You mentioned the flower massacre. That footage was circulating for about 3 days, I think, before BBC verified the video. So for many people, for me, that situation was actually symptomatic of the problem that we've had in general, and particularly a problem the mainstream media has had, is that if it takes you 3 days to verify a video that's been circulating very widely, and which most people have sort of kind of seen now from multiple angles, it gets very difficult to trust that outlet to deliver the news in the way that you think it should be, which is promptly and accurately, because obviously this is happening, minute by minute, hour by hour. Yeah.
Is it a structural bias?
I mean, look, is there structural bias in the media? Is a bit like asking if there's a structural bias within society. Absolutely. We live within the context of a white supremacist structure where, very, very clearly there are certain lives which are considered more valuable than others. And that is reflected in, who dies in police custody, just like it's reflected in who humanitarian principles are applied to, or who gets to see human rights law upheld for them. And so, yes, there is absolutely a structural issue of bias within our society more broadly that's then reflected, I think, in our newsrooms, where unfortunately a very latent form of Islamophobia, of anti-Muslim sentiment, of perception of Muslims and Islam and Arabs as being sort of one huge dangerous thing that exists out there to threaten us. Absolutely, there's a whole group of people who probably don't know much more about the Middle East than that sort of vague perception of it. And does that seep into coverage? Absolutely. Does it seep into sort of dehumanizing people to the extent that actually when we see headlines being written, we systematically see Palestinians being referred to in terms that are negating their basic humanity? The evidence is plentiful.
I mean, I think what I'm trying to get at is also, I trying to get at what your view of the heart of this all is. I mean, for example, there's been a lot of talk about double standards in politics, right? When it comes to Gaza, there's a double standard in politics, especially when it comes to the global powers. But critics of the media have also said that there's a double standard in media coverage when it comes to Gaza. Gaza has been going on for a few months now, and I think some people may ask, well, why hasn't, despite these growing calls or growing criticisms of the media, why hasn't the media's coverage, mainstream media's coverage, shifted a bit when it comes to covering Gaza?
Well, so in the last week, we have seen over 50 plus mainstream journalists from places as far reaching as Sky, Reuters, the BBC, and elsewhere sign an open letter to the Israelis demanding access to Gaza. I think we've also seen a number of reports now that are more and more recognizing that what we're looking at is less of a war and more of an onslaught. It's very difficult to argue that this is a war when it's so asymmetrical in nature, right? The majority of people who are being killed in Gaza are civilians. The people who are being starved right now are civilians. And so I do personally think that there has been a shift in the last few weeks, maybe not as much as we might hope. I think the main thing that I would hope for more of is some serious accountability of Israeli officials. For too long, many mainstream outlets, not least because many Israelis, of course, are just Westerners who have pitched up their tent on other people's land. Because of that, there is this sort of sense of proximity to their spokespeople. They talk like you and me. They look like you and me because they are you and me. And so there is this sort of natural affinity that occurs through proximity to whiteness, and this is ultimately partly to do with racial politics. So I think there's the extent to which the media has sort of looked at Israelis as being us. And therefore, there's this assumption of kind of white innocence and of them being sort of, playing by the rules that the West sort of presents itself.
You're saying that's why they're not being held to account.
I'm saying that that's why they are not being held to account to the standard that I would hope to. I think there is too much what we might call goodwill being provided to them, this assumption that of course they must be trying their best, of course they're just waging a war, and things are difficult in war. And I think that if we were sat opposite a Congolese general or a Sudanese general, or if we were sat opposite a Libyan general, the questions would look rather different. And that's the bit that I personally find deeply infuriating, that actually where we're at with a number of deaths, particularly very clearly and unequivocally today, over 25,000 women and children, that actually when you sat opposite an Israeli spokesperson, you damn well need to have done your homework, because at this point, allowing them to rant on with lies after lies in the public arena, which are debunked within seconds of the interview being finished by people on the internet, suggests that we are not doing our jobs. right? That we are not doing our jobs. If you're being debunked by Julie on TikTok, right? If that interview you just conducted is being pulled apart by Julie on TikTok, and you're a paid up senior journalist in a newsroom, there's a problem.
And this will be my last question for you, Dr. Myriam, but what are you most hopeful for? Where do we go from here with respect to the media?
Look, ultimately, the problem that we have with regards to the coverage of Gaza is a much wider problem, just like the government's response to Gaza is part of a wider problem of unaccountability. What we have as an issue here in the UK, and is even worse in the US, is private interests, wealthy individuals who start up their own news channels as their own sort of propaganda machines, right? So don't look over here at all of our corruption and, theft of public institutions and funds and public goods. No, don't look over here. Look over here at all the little brown people that we're saying are so terrible. Let's send them off to Rwanda. So, there's entire channels funded by the people who don't want you to look over here to make you look over here. And I think until we start to really rethink the way that our media is constructed and the extent to which it is negatively impacting our democracies, we are going to continue down this route of being essentially largely manipulated by people who have a vested interest in keeping the majority of people ignorant of the real roots of the problems affecting them. And so you asked me where my hope lies. It lies on both on the media and with regards to wider accountability of the government with the people. It always lies with the people. For too long, people have become complacent about the extent to which we are active political participants in our democracies. For too long, we have let those representatives, those MPs, run the country thinking that they were going to do it in the public interest, and they are not doing it in the public interest. So we have to start reclaiming power, joining trade unions, getting organized, and demanding accountability by any means possible at this point.
And on that note, I appreciate your time, Dr. Myriam Francois. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for giving us a glimpse of your take. Appreciate it so much.
Cool. Thanks so much. Have a good one.
You too. Thanks so much.